The air of the frontier was always heavy with dust, smoke, and secrets, a land of promise and peril, where men carved their lives with calloused hands and women bore silent strength, waiting for the next turn of fate. Out there in the wild stretches of the West, nothing was simple. Every glance carried a weight, every silence hid a story, and every choice could spark either redemption or ruin. It was a world where laws were written not on paper but in the eyes of those who dared to stand their ground. The town sat like a stubborn outpost against the endless desert, saloons lit with oil lamps and its streets echoing with the clatter of boots and wagon wheels. Horses snorted in the cool night air, restless as if they too sensed the tension that ran under every conversation. Folks here lived close to the edge, not just of the land but of themselves. The West had a way of stripping people bare, showing what they were made of when nothing but survival and desire pushed them forward. It was on such a restless night that she arrived. Wrapped in a simple cloak, her figure carried the grace of someone used to hiding in plain sight. Her steps were quiet, but every man on the wooden porch of the saloon lifted his head to watch her pass. She was not like the women of the town. There was a fire in her gaze that seemed to burn against the dusty backdrop of the streets. She walked as if danger trailed behind her, and perhaps it did. For no woman crossed the desert alone without reason, and hers had the taste of something forbidden. He was already there, leaning against the rail outside the saloon, shadowed by the golden glow of lantern light. Tall, broad, and rough-edged, his presence carried both warning and promise. His shirt hung open at the throat, and his dark hair was tied loosely at the nape. He was the kind of man the law distrusted and women feared to trust, yet his silence spoke louder than the rowdiest drunk inside the saloon. When his eyes lifted to meet hers, it was like two storms colliding, each recognizing the danger in the other. The Wild West did not forgive softness. Men fought over land, cattle, and honor. Women learned to guard their hearts as fiercely as their lives. Yet sometimes, in the cracks of such a harsh world, passion sparked in ways no law or rule could smother. Their eyes lingered longer than they should, and in that stolen moment the air between them grew heavy with a tension no one else could feel. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening, as if already bracing against the pull she carried with her. She lowered her gaze, but not before he caught the flicker of defiance, mixed with longing. Inside the saloon, the piano stumbled through a half-drunk tune while laughter rose and fell like waves. But outside, time slowed, and the dusty wind whispered around them. She stepped closer, brushing past men who muttered and tipped their hats, though none dared block her path. She had come for something, or perhaps someone, and her determination was clear, even if her secret was not. He knew trouble when he saw it, and she was trouble-wrapped in silken silence. Still, he did not move aside when she reached the steps where he stood. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of gravel and smoke. Her chin lifted, the lantern light catching the edge of her face. "Neither do you." That answer drew the faintest hint of a smile across his rough features. For in those words, she had revealed a piece of herself, one that echoed his own truth. Both were outcasts in a land that tolerated no weakness, bound not by choice but by something deeper, something dangerous. The West had a way of pulling such souls together, forging bonds in fire, even as it tried to tear them apart. Whispers swirled around them, curious eyes peering from the saloon windows, but they heard none of it. He studied her, trying to read the story hidden behind her guarded expression. She studied him back, though hers was not a gaze of fear, but of testing. There was a challenge in her silence, as if daring him to see beyond what the rest of the world thought she was. A horse whinnied sharply at the hitching post, startling the moment into motion. She brushed past him then, her cloak sweeping against his arm, leaving behind the faint scent of something both wild and familiar. He turned to watch her enter the saloon, every instinct warning him that nothing about this night would end the way it began. She was a woman carrying shadows, and he was a man already marked by his own. Together, they were bound to stir the kind of storm that left trails across the desert, and stories etched into the bones of the West. She moved through the crowded saloon with a calmness that set her apart. Men turned their heads, voices lowered, and yet she walked as though their stares were nothing but wind. She made her way toward the back, where a game of cards had grown heated, gold coins clinking against the scarred wooden table. He followed, though from a distance, his boots striking the floor with quiet certainty. He knew he should stay clear, but something about her demanded he draw closer, as if fate itself had tied a rope around his chest and pulled. At the card table sat men whose names carried weight in Whispers Land barons. Gunfighters, men with reputations as sharp as their knives. She paused, her gaze narrowing on one in particular, and in that pause, the room itself seemed to tighten. The man she stared at laughed loudly, slamming his cards down, his hand moving toward his whiskey glass with a swagger that spoke of arrogance. She did not blink, and the silence of her stare cut sharper than any blade. He leaned against the post near the bar, watching his hand resting near the grip of his revolver. He did not know her story, but he could see the shape of it forming vengeance maybe, or something even deeper. The danger of it called to him, and though he tried to steady his breath, he could not stop the pull. The piano stilled, the laughter dimmed. Even the smoke in the air seemed to pause, thick and waiting. She stepped closer to the card table, and the man sitting there finally lifted his gaze to her. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by surprise, and then the sharp edge of fear. The saloon grew colder in that heartbeat, and all eyes shifted between her and the man who had suddenly forgotten his winning hand. From where he stood, the stranger who had been watching clenched his jaw. He didn't know yet what she carried in her heart, but he knew one thing with certainty: whatever came next was about to shake not just the saloon, but the town, and maybe even the whole stretch of desert that surrounded them. And as the silence broke, as her lips parted to speak, the night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite everything. The room was so quiet that the crackle of the lantern flames seemed louder than the shuffle of boots outside. The men at the card table shifted in their seats, uneasy with the way her eyes stayed fixed on the man with the whiskey glass. His grin faltered, though he tried to hide it by reaching for his drink. His hand trembled just enough for those nearest to notice. What? She hadn't spoken yet, but the weight of her silence was enough to cut through the smoky air. Every soul in that saloon knew something was coming, though none dared say a word. From the post where he stood, the stranger's gaze never left her. He had seen many kinds of danger in his life: gunmen who carried death in their eyes, drifters who hid knives behind their smiles, but there was something different about this woman. She carried herself with the calm of someone who had walked through fire before and come out unburned. Yet he could sense she was not untouched by it. Pain clung to her like a shadow, hidden beneath her steady poise. The man at the table finally set his glass down, his voice breaking the stillness. "You lost your way, lady?" he asked, forcing a laugh. His words were sharp, but his tone carried an edge of fear. She tilted her head, the faintest curve at her lips, though her eyes never softened. "I found exactly where I meant to be." The stranger felt his chest tighten at her words. They were simple, but they carried meaning he couldn't yet name. He shifted his stance, his hand brushing once more against the revolver at his hip, though he did not draw it. Not yet. He had no claim in this fight, whatever it was. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already bound to it. The piano player cleared his throat, fingers fumbling over the keys, trying to bring sound back into the room. But the tune faltered almost as soon as it began, swallowed by the tension that coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. No one knew her story, not yet. Rumors would come later, carried in whispers across town, but for now, all that mattered was the way she stood. Unflinching before a man whose name had been spoken in fear more than once. He was no ordinary gambler. He held land and power, had men who worked his will, and a past painted in dust and blood. Folks didn't look him in the eye unless they had reason. And here she was, staring him down without a flicker of doubt. The stranger studied the lines of her face, the curve of her shoulders beneath the cloak. Something in her look spoke of unfinished business, a reckoning that had traveled miles of desert to arrive at this very table. He wondered what tied her to this man, what wound or betrayal bound their lives together in ways none of the others could see. The gambler finally pushed back his chair, rising to his feet with a lazy arrogance. "I don't recall inviting you here," he said, his voice louder now, trying to mask his unease. His hand rested on the edge of the table, close to where his pistol lay hidden beneath the coat slung over the chair. She didn't move, didn't flinch, though the stranger caught the subtle rise and fall of her breath. She was steady, but not cold. He could see it now, the fire behind her calm, the strength that came not from pride but from something deeper, something raw. He knew this was not the time to interfere. Yet he also knew men like the one standing at the table. They didn't forgive insult. They didn't forget the past. They didn't let anyone walk away without a cost. The saloon doors creaked as a pair of cowhands slipped out, unable to bear the tension. The night air swept in briefly, carrying the smell of dust and sage, before the doors shut again. Inside, all eyes remained on her and the man before her. The stranger felt his pulse steady into a rhythm, the kind he always carried before a fight he hadn't yet chosen. But she spoke first. Her voice was soft, almost too soft for such a charged moment, but it carried through the room like a whip crack. You took something that wasn't yours, and I've come to take it back. The words froze everyone in place. Some looked at one another, puzzled, while others leaned forward, hungry for the truth behind them. The gambler's grin returned, though thinner this time, stretched tight over his jaw. I've taken plenty of things. You'll have to be more clear. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment the stranger thought she might draw steel right there in the heart of the saloon. But instead she only stepped closer, her cloak brushing against the edge of the table. You know what I mean, she said, her voice firmer now. The gambler's laughter rang out, brittle and forced. He tipped his hat back, showing the lines of a man who had lived too long by his own rules. But beneath the laugh, his eyes betrayed him. They flicked nervously, not at her, but at the stranger standing near the bar, as though he feared not just her, but what her presence might stir in others. The stranger caught that look, and though no words were spoken, he understood. Whatever tied these two together was more dangerous than most in the room realized. And now, by watching too closely, he had been pulled into the web as well. The tension stretched, thin as glass. She stood steady. The gambler shifted his weight, and the stranger's fingers brushed again against his revolver, though still he did not draw. He had seen enough to know the night was far from finished. In the silence that followed, the sound of boots on the wooden porch outside broke through. Heavy, purposeful steps. The doors swung open, and in came three men dressed in dust and leather, their eyes sharp, their hands already near their weapons. They moved straight toward the gambler, but their gaze flicked once to her, then to the stranger. The room held its breath once more. The gambler smirked now, bolstered by the arrival of his men. Seems I've got company, he said, his voice dripping with confidence. Now tell me, lady, do you still want to take back what's mine? She did not step back. If anything, her stance grew firmer, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. It was never yours to keep, she answered, her tone steady. The stranger knew then that whatever lay between them ran deeper than pride, deeper than power. This was about blood or honor or both, and it would not end with words alone. He could feel it like a storm pressing against the horizon, inevitable and unforgiving. The men who had just entered shifted closer, their presence turning the saloon into a powder keg. The gambler's laughter came again, but this time it was darker, edged with menace. The piano player stood and slipped quietly away, unwilling to be caught in what was coming. A few others followed, their boots creaking against the floor as they left behind their drinks and their curiosity. Yet the stranger stayed. He could have walked out, could have left the woman to her fight, and the gambler to his men. But his feet would not move. Something in her gaze, something in the way she stood, bound him there. He didn't yet know her name or her story, but he knew she was about to change his. The gambler leaned forward, his smile sharp as a knife. Then show me where, he taunted, his voice low, meant for her ears alone. Her eyes flickered once toward the stranger, just enough to let him know he had been seen, that she knew he was watching. And then she turned back to the man before her, her lips parting with a single word that carried all the weight of the desert night. The saloon went silent again, waiting, as though the very walls leaned closer to catch what came next. Her word cut through the smoke and silence. Though it was spoken low, it carried enough weight to make the gambler's grin stiffen. No one in the saloon could mistake the iron in her tone. She had not come here for games or to stir fear without cause. Whatever she carried inside her chest had been forged over long miles and longer nights, sharpened like steel. The stranger leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, trying to catch every detail as if the truth might slip past him if he looked away. The gambler's men shifted restlessly, hands brushing against their pistols, waiting for a signal. But the gambler held them back with a single glance. He wanted to enjoy this, to draw it out, to make her reveal her hand before he revealed his. He thrived on power, and in this moment, he still believed he held it, yet the way his jaw tightened betrayed him. He knew her words meant something only the two of them fully understood. The stranger's mind raced with questions. Who was she to him? What had he taken that she swore to reclaim? Land, gold, a life. The West was littered with broken promises and stolen futures. Men like the gambler built their empires on such thefts. But women like her women who crossed deserts alone, carrying fire in their eyes, did not rise from nowhere. Her story was rooted in pain and defiance, and the stranger felt a dangerous pull toward uncovering it. Around them, the saloon had thinned. Only the bold or the foolish remained. A handful of drinkers lingered in the corners, too curious to leave. The barkeep polished glasses with nervous hands, his eyes darting from the woman to the gambler and back again. Every man left in that room knew they were witnessing the start of something that would not end quietly. The gambler finally spoke again, his tone sharp as a whip. You're far from where you ought to be. Whatever you think you've come for, you'll find nothing but regret. Her voice held steady as she answered. I've lived with regret. Doesn't scare me anymore. That struck deeper than any threat. Even the stranger felt it, like the echo of a wound carried too long. She wasn't bluffing, wasn't playing at courage. She had already faced whatever most men feared, and now she was here to collect a debt that went beyond coin or cattle. The gambler laughed again, but his men didn't share it. Their eyes flicked toward her with unease, and a few toward the stranger as if gauging whether he'd stand aside if things turned bloody. The gambler noticed, and his smile faltered before he turned it sharp again. Then maybe you ought to learn what fear really feels like. The stranger shifted his weight, a low growl forming in his throat, though no words followed. He had no place in this fight, not yet. But he had walked the frontier long enough to know when violence was coming. He could almost taste it in the air, bitter and heavy. Still, she didn't flinch. Her calm was not that of someone ignorant of danger, but of someone who had already chosen her path. She stepped closer, her cloak brushing the edge of the gambler's coat, and the saloon seemed to shrink around them. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity. The stranger's hand hovered near his revolver again. He told himself he would not draw unless forced, yet in his chest he knew the truth. He was already bound to this moment, and when steel was drawn, his hand would rise of its own will. Before either could move, the doors slammed open again. This time it wasn't the gambler's men, but townsfolk, 2 lawmen. Their badges dulled by dust, followed by the preacher, face pale in the lantern light. The lawmen stopped short at the scene before them. They had expected drunken brawls, maybe a knife fight, not the stillness of a storm about to break. The preacher's eyes locked on her, widening with recognition. He whispered her name, too soft for most to hear, but the stranger caught it. A name, finally. It wasn't one he knew, but the way it left the preacher's lips carried history, maybe even sorrow. The gambler's smirk cracked. For the first time that night, real fear flickered in his eyes. He didn't want her name spoken aloud, didn't want her past unveiled in front of this crowd. The stranger caught that too, and his curiosity burned hotter. Whatever tied them together wasn't just personal, it was something the whole town might understand if they knew the truth. The lawmen stepped forward, hands near their holsters. "What's going on here?" one demanded, his voice hard, though his eyes darted nervously. He wasn't eager to cross the gambler, not with his men standing close. But the woman's steady stance unsettled him too. No one answered, not her, not the gambler, not the stranger. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the wooden floor beneath shifting boots. Finally, the preacher stepped closer, his voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't your fight, Sheriff. Not yet. This is a matter that's been waiting too long to surface." The gambler cursed under his breath, his mask slipping. He snapped his fingers, and his men tensed, ready to move. But before steel cleared leather, the woman lifted her hand, palm open. "Not tonight," she said. Her tone was so calm it stunned them into stillness. Even the gambler's men hesitated, unsure whether to follow his order or her command. The stranger frowned. Why call off the storm when she held the fire? Why stop now, when the room was hers? Unless she had something larger in mind, something beyond a single night's bloodshed. The gambler seized the pause to retake his ground. He leaned close to her, his words meant to cut, run back to whatever hole you crawled from. This town is mine. Always was. Always will be. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking. Not anymore. That answer was quiet, yet it shook the gambler more than any shout. He pushed past her then, his men following close, storming out into the night with anger snapping in every step. The saloon doors swung wide and slammed shut, leaving behind the echo of boots and the bitter scent of tension. Only then did the room breathe again. The lawmen relaxed their stance, though they still eyed the woman warily. The preacher lingered, his gaze heavy with words unsaid. The stranger remained where he was, though his chest rose with slow, controlled breaths. She stood alone in the center of the room, cloak drawn around her shoulders, her fire banked but not gone. The stares pressed on her, but she bore them as if she had carried heavier burdens before. The stranger stepped forward at last, his boots steady on the floorboards. He stopped a few paces from her, his voice low. "You've stirred something that won't settle easy." Her gaze met his, calm but unyielding. It was already stirring. I only gave it breath. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. He could respect that. But he also knew she hadn't shown her full hand, not tonight. Whatever storm she had set in motion would draw him in whether he liked it or not. The preacher finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "You can't stay hidden now. They'll come for you, and anyone who stands near you." She didn't flinch. Let them. The stranger felt the air shift again, not with fear, but with certainty. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. And though he had no claim to her fight, something inside told him he wouldn't walk away from it. The night outside was quiet, too quiet for a town like this. Somewhere out there, the gambler was already plotting his next move, and his men would be restless with anger. But inside the saloon, the woman stood firm, her presence shaking the foundations of a place built on silence and fear. The stranger took one last look at her before turning away, though every step toward the door felt heavier. He knew he'd be back, drawn not by choice but by the force of something larger than himself. And as the doors swung open, the desert night rushed in again, carrying with it the promise of more than dust and stars. It carried the weight of reckoning. The gambler did not sleep that night. His boots paced the length of his quarters above the saloon, the floorboards creaking under each turn. A bottle of whiskey sat half empty on the table, the glass untouched beside it. His men had gone quiet downstairs, but their voices still lingered in his mind, heavy with unease. For years he had ruled this town with coin, fear, and the kind of charm that came wrapped in cruelty. Yet the moment she had stepped through those doors, it had all begun to slip. Her presence was a knife in the dark, cutting through the confidence he had built. He stared at the lamp on the table, its flame flickering in the draught. She had spoken her words calmly, but they had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Not anymore. 2 words that clawed at him, reminding him of a truth he had buried. She had come not just to confront him, but to unearth something he thought long dead. And if she did, all he had claimed as his would crumble into dust. Outside, the desert was quiet, save for the cry of a coyote. The town lay in uneasy sleep, but beneath its silence stirred questions. Those who had been in the saloon whispered her name already, though few dared say it above a breath. By morning, the whole town would know she was back. Some would fear it. Some would welcome it. Some would be foolish enough to test it. The stranger lay awake too, stretched on a cot in the boarding house at the edge of town. His eyes traced the shadows on the ceiling, mind restless with the weight of what he had seen. He had walked into countless fights before, seen men kill each other over land, women, cards, or pride. But this was different. This was not just a quarrel between 2 souls, it was the stirring of something larger. Something rooted deep in the ground of the town itself. She had brought with her a fire that could not be smothered, and though he had no reason to stand in its path, he knew he would. He thought of the way she had looked at him in the saloon, not pleading, not begging, but acknowledging. As though she had marked him already, drawn him into her circle without words. It unsettled him, yet it also steadied him. For years he had drifted from town to town, never staying, never belonging. Now, against his own will, he felt the ground pull him to stay. At the church, the preacher sat alone in the dim glow of candles, his head bowed in prayer. His hands trembled as they clutched the Bible, though his mind was not on Scripture, but on the past. He had known her before the desert had hardened her, before she had vanished into silence. Her return now was both blessing and curse. Blessing because she carried truth that should never have been buried. Curse because truth was often paid for in blood. He whispered her name again, as if saying it might ease the weight pressing on his chest, but the night gave no answer. By dawn, the gamblers' men were already moving. They rode out in pairs, circling the town, keeping watch on the roads and the boarding house. Their presence was a message no. One crossed the gambler without consequence. The townsfolk noticed, their morning routines heavy with unease. Mothers drew their children closer, shopkeepers kept their voices low, and ranchers who came in for supplies did not linger. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. She, however, did not hide. Wrapped in her cloak, she walked the streets as though they were hers, her steps calm, her gaze steady. Each man who passed her lowered his eyes, not out of respect, but out of something deeper recognition that she carried a purpose they could not touch. Hey! She stopped at the blacksmith's, exchanged quiet words. She visited the general store, speaking briefly with the owner. Everywhere she went, eyes followed her. Whispers stirred, and the storm grew heavier. The stranger trailed her at a distance, his presence unseen by most, though she seemed to sense him all the same. Once, she turned her head just slightly, her eyes brushing his before she continued on her way. It wasn't thanks or warning. It was something more, a reminder that their paths were now bound, whether either of them had chosen it or not. By noon, the gambler stepped onto the main street, flanked by his men. He wore his confidence like armor, his coat heavy with gold trim, his revolver polished at his hip. His voice carried across the street as he called for the townsfolk to gather. They came slowly, drawn by curiosity and fear alike. He spoke of order, of loyalty, of how he had built the town from dust into trade. He painted himself as protector, provider, and master. But beneath his words, the crowd's unease thickened. They had seen his power before, had felt the cost of it. Now they looked at him with different eyes, because they had also seen her. She stepped into view then, at the far end of the street, her cloak pulled back, her stance unyielding. The crowd shifted, whispers rising into a murmur. "Okay." The gambler's voice faltered for a breath, but he caught himself, turning his words sharp. "This town is mine," he declared, pointing toward her. "And anyone who stands with her stands against me." The silence that followed was heavy. The townsfolk looked between them, their faces torn. The stranger watched from the edge of the crowd, his hand resting near his revolver. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in, the ground trembling with the promise of blood. "Wait." The preacher stepped forward, his voice shaking but strong. "The town is not yours. It belongs to those who live and die here, not to the hand that steals from them." The gambler's eyes flared with rage, his hand twitching toward his pistol. His men stepped closer, their boots kicking dust into the air. The crowd gasped, some pulling back, others frozen. She did not move. She stood with her chin high, her gaze fixed on him, her voice cutting clear. "You've taken enough. It ends now." The gambler's laugh was harsh, echoing through the street. "You think you can take from me? You think anyone here will stand by your side?" The stranger's pulse quickened. This was the moment, the thin edge, where words would give way to bullets. He scanned the crowd, noting how some men shifted uneasily, their hands curling into fists, their eyes darting between her and the gambler. The town was tired of silence, tired of fear. She had given them something they had not felt in years, a spark of defiance. But sparks could burn, and fire could consume. The gambler drew his pistol halfway from its holster, slow enough for all to see. His men followed suit, iron glinting in the harsh sun. Dust swirled in the street, and the air grew thick with the stench of gun oil and sweat. The stranger stepped forward now, no longer willing to watch from the shadows. His voice was steady, carrying across the crowd. "If you're looking for someone to stand with her, you've found him." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. The gambler sneered, his pistol glinting in the light. "Then you'll die with her." The stranger's hand hovered at his side, his muscles coiled like a spring. The preacher moved to stand between them, but the gambler's men shoved him back, their revolvers aimed. The crowd shifted again, panic edging into their murmurs. The tension was unbearable. Every man and woman in that street felt it pressing down, the moment stretched thin as glass. One wrong move, One twitch of a finger, and the silence would shatter into chaos. She stepped forward then, her voice calm, her eyes locked on the gambler. "If you want me, you'll have to take me yourself. Leave them out of it." The gambler's smirk widened, though his hand trembled. Gladly the street froze. Dust lifted in the wind, horses snorted, and the sun bore down mercilessly. Guns hung ready, hearts pounded, and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath. The stranger steadied himself, his eyes fixed on the gambler's hand. He knew the next heartbeat would decide everything. The street was locked in silence, so tight that even the desert wind seemed to hold back. Dust hung in the air like smoke, drifting slowly between the boots of the gambler, his men. And the crowd gathered to witness what felt like the birth of something no one could stop. The stranger's jaw tightened as his eyes fixed on the gambler's hand, knowing one twitch could change everything. She stood just a few steps ahead, her cloak trailing in the dirt, her gaze unbroken. It was as if the whole town balanced on the edge of her stare. The gambler's pistol gleamed in the sunlight, half drawn, ready to rise. His men fanned out, iron in hand, their eyes sharp, waiting for his signal. What he had ruled long enough that no one had dared stand against him. But now, for the first time, the balance was shifting. He saw it in the faces of the townsfolk, their eyes no longer lowered, but lifted, watching not him but her. That burned deeper than any bullet could, and he hated her for it. The preacher struggled to his feet, his voice breaking through the tension. "This doesn't need blood," he called, though his hands trembled as he held his Bible close to his chest. "There's another way." But no one moved. No one believed peace could hold. The gambler laughed harshly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Another way? There's only one way I know, and it's carved in lead." His words were meant to scare the crowd back into silence, but instead, a murmur rose among them. Some men shifted closer to one another. Some women clutched their children's shoulders tighter. Fear was still there, but mixed with it now was something stronger: anger. The West had taught them to swallow pain, but pain had a way of turning into fire when given a spark. And she was the spark. The stranger stepped forward, his boots crunching in the dust, placing himself between her and the gambler's men. He didn't draw yet, but his hand hovered close, his eyes cold and steady. "If you want her," he said, his voice deep, carrying to every ear in the crowd, "you'll have to come through me." The crowd gasped, and the gambler's face twisted with rage. For a long time, no one had dared to stand against him so openly. Now a drifter, a man he didn't even know, had planted himself in the path. It wasn't just defiance, it was an insult he couldn't ignore. The gambler's pistol lifted another inch, and his men tightened their grips on their weapons. The stranger's stance shifted, weight balanced, ready. The preacher tried again, desperation in his voice. "Don't do this. Once the guns are drawn, there's no going back." The gambler spat into the dirt, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "There's no going back anyway. Not since she walked into my town." Her voice cut through, calm and steady. "It was never your town." That struck deeper than any bullet. The gambler's jaw clenched, his eyes flaring with fury. He raised his pistol higher, and the crowd held its breath. Every heart beat faster, every muscle tensed, every whisper died in the heat of that moment. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence became unbearable. A child cried out, the sound sharp in the stillness. It jolted everyone, but no one moved. The gambler's hand twitched, and the stranger's fingers brushed his revolver's grip. Sweat slid down the side of his temple, though his expression never shifted. The crowd seemed ready to scatter, but something kept them rooted. Perhaps it was the years of fear they had swallowed. Perhaps it was the fire they saw in her eyes, the steady defiance that seemed to say the time had come. Whatever it was, no one turned away. The gambler's men shifted again, trying to close the circle. Dust swirled around their boots, rising in the dry wind. The preacher's voice shook as he tried to speak once more, but the sound was drowned out by the tension crackling in the air like thunder. She stepped forward suddenly, past the stranger, past the reach of safety, until she stood face to face with the gambler. The crowd gasped again, some calling her name, but she did not falter. Eyes locked on his, and for the first time, he looked unsettled, almost cornered. "You built your empire on lies and blood," she said, her voice cutting clear. "And you think fear will keep it standing, but fear has its limits. You've reached them." Her words rippled through the crowd. Men who had once bowed their heads now straightened their backs. Women who had once stayed silent now lifted their eyes. The gambler saw it, felt it, and his fury grew. He couldn't afford to let her words take root. Not here, not now. Enough, he growled, raising his pistol fully. His men followed, weapons gleaming. The stranger's revolver slid into his hand in a blur, the barrel aimed square at the gambler's chest. The crowd shouted, some scattering to the sides, some frozen in place. Horses reared against their posts, the smell of sweat and leather filling the air. The standoff was set. No one blinked. No one blinked. The sun burned overhead, and the world seemed to narrow to this one street, this one moment. The gambler sneered, his voice low and deadly. You think you can stand against me? You'll die for her before the town lifts a hand. But even as he said it, he could see the truth in their faces. The town was shifting, no longer his to control. She had done in one night what years of his power could not undo, and that truth made his finger itch on the trigger. The stranger's voice rumbled low, calm yet sharp. Quiet. Time stretched thin. Every sound seemed aloud: the creak of leather, the whisper of wind, the pounding of hearts. The gambler's hand trembled, his finger tightening. The stranger's revolver stayed steady, ready to fire in the same instant. She did not move, her stance firm, her gaze locked on the gambler with unshakable fire. Her presence alone was enough to hold the crowd in place, enough to keep the gambler from feeling the certainty he once carried. The preacher dropped to his knees, praying aloud, his words tumbling fast and desperate. Lord, stay their hands, for blood cannot wash away blood. But even he knew his prayer was a whisper against the roar about to break. The gambler's men shifted once more, their guns gleaming like the fangs of wolves. Stranger's muscles tensed, ready for the first shot. And she stood in the center of it all, the storm's heart, unflinching, as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. The gambler bared his teeth, a growl deep in his chest. This ends now. And in the breath that followed, the world seemed to stop.